Coast Artillery Corps. We're going to be sort of focusing, focusing on them, but we're going to be talking about a few other little things as we go along on the Steele. As you all know, in 1901, the artillery splits. Up to this time, the artillery was, I like to say, split into field artillery and garrison artillery. And depending upon what the Army's the War Department's move was, you as a lieutenant was in the field artillery or the garrison artillery. So you might find yourself out with the artillery in the Western Plains, or you might just find yourself down at Fort Jefferson or Fort Warren or some other place indirectly. Field artillery was basically direct fire, and coast artillery became indirect fire. I will admit, up until the 1880s, both were direct fire, but after the 1880s, you start getting coast artillery doing indirect fire, which leads to problems in World War I, because the field artillery is still firing the 3-inch direct fire gun. And this is a modern war in Europe in which you're doing indirect fire. So you guys are familiar with the bit that the coast artillery comes over, mans the 155s and the bigger, mans the trench mortars of all weird things, and mans the anti-aircraft guns, which causes this disharmony between the field artillery and the coast artillery. But that's a slight little side story about what happens out of the split that takes place. And then what's it, in 1950, they merge everything back in the artillery. Okay, the Coast Artillery Chief of Staffs. And by the way, all the branches have a Chief of Staff. He is a staff officer, not a line officer. So when he is promoted to Chief of whatever he is, Chief of the Coast Artillery, his confirmation does not have to go through Congress because he's a staff officer. Only line officers, when they become a flag officer, do they have to be approved by Congress. So from 1908 to 1960, the Chief of Staff, on being promoted to Chief of Staff, was a Brigadier General. He still retains his a regular Army commission, generally a colonel, but he gets to wear the stars. He's been, I forget what they call that when they give you stars to wear, but you're really not that. And from 1960 to 42, he's a major general. Now, if he does not retire at the end of his time as chief of staff as, quote, a major general and remains in service, he reverts back to his regular Army rank. So this is why all these guys will retire at the end of their time. Well, not everybody does, as chief of the Coast Artillery Corps, is because that then they get to retire at that rank. Okay, here they are. Brigadier General Arthur Murray, 1908 to 1911. Major General Erasmus M. Weaver. What if he's any relation to our Weaver? 1911 to 1918. Major General Frank W. Coe, 1918 to 1926. A great name, Major General Andrew Hero, Jr., 1926 to 1930. Major General John Gulick, 1930 to 34. Major General William F. Haas, 1934 to 35. Major General Henry L. Steele, once again, another great name, 1935 to 36. Major General Archibald A. Sutherland, 36 to 40. And then the last one, Major General Joseph A. Green. Okay, we'll take a little closer look at each one of these guys. Major General Arthur Murray, July 1908 to March 1911. Born 1951 in Missouri. He's buried at the Arlington National Cemetery. Died in 25. Graduated from West Point. Interesting, his life. He's 74. He didn't graduate in 69. Let me apologize. He becomes a cadet in 69. Graduates in 74 and becomes a lieutenant in the 1st Artillery. 1880, student artillery school. 81 to 86, he's an instructor at West Point. And you see this quite often after guys are sent to school, they become a instructor at West Point or somewhere else. 86 to 91, he's on general staff. That means he's working for the War Department. And then from 91 to 96, he's on the artillery staff. And for some reason, from 96 to 99, there's nothing listed. And I'm wondering if he's on leave or something during this period, which occasionally would happen. They would turn him loose. However, Spanish-American War is in there. But there is nothing in his records what he's doing during the Spanish-American War. Okay, and this is weird. 1899, 1901, he's commanding officer of the 43rd Infantry in the Philippines. Well, maybe again, it's not so weird because all of a sudden you find out that they're short of officers to command the increase in the army that happens during the Spanish-American War. We're going to backtrack a little bit. The U.S. Army is small coming up to the War of 1812. It expands rapidly during the War of 1812. Now, need to back up 1 second. Promotion in the U.S. Army is weird. As an officer, you're promoted in your regiment from second lieutenant to first lieutenant to captain. From major to lieutenant colonel to colonel, you're promoted within your corps, per se, the artillery corps. So generally, you don't see guys leaving their branch that they're in, except you wind up when they do the Philippine insurrection and they're expanding the army. They're doing, oops, I forgot it. Also got off my track. Need to back up again. War of 1812, they expand the army. You heard what I said about army, your life, and the regular army grows. So you get a bunch of guys that transfer from their regiment to another regiment because no longer am I first lieutenant, I'm now a major in this regiment. Well, when the war's over with, they collapse the army back to what it was before pre-war. And you're major of the 25th Artillery, which no longer exists. There's only 4 artillery regiments. You're going to go back to the 4th Artillery. Whoops, sorry, guys. These positions are already full. Oh, wow, this is bad. They do the same thing during the Mexican-American War and the same thing during the Civil War. So the regular army guys have learned that you don't do anything like this. So when the Spanish-American War comes along, you don't see the regular army officers running off to fill these new regular army things because they know what's going to happen. They're going to collapse. But it doesn't happen after the Spanish-American War. Yes, they do collapse some, but they don't collapse all. Okay, so this runs into some problem. So here you are with an artillery guy commanding an infantry regiment in the Philippines during the Philippine insurrection. He comes back and he's CO of the School of Submarine Defense at Fort Monroe. 1905, he becomes chief of the artillery. 1908, 1911, he's chief of the Coast Artillery Corps. He's a brigadier general. Whoa, wait a minute. He remains in and he goes back to assistant chief of War Department. He's back to being a colonel. Weird. I don't know why he didn't retire. 1970-18, he's commanding officer, Western Department. He does get back up to brigadier general then. Retired due to age in 1918. I would assume when the war is over with, although they might have retired him sooner, it didn't say, and dies in 1925. So here we're looking at our first chief of the Coast Artillery Corps. He wrote the manual for court martials, and he worked on the design of Fort Hancock, New Jersey in 1891. And in Panama, Battery Murray at Fort Kobe, 2 16-inch guns are named for our general. They also named a mine planter for him, the Major General Arthur Murray, which became the USS Trapper ACM-9, a mine sweeper. From 1946 to 59, it became the Coast Guard Yamakar. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it was the movie Onion Head as the periwinkle. So our next one is Erastus M. Weaver Jr., 1911 to 1918. Born in Tippecanoe County, Indiana, 1854, and he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. He was at West Point as a cadet from 71 to 75, goes to the 2nd Artillery from 75 to 77. Then he's an instructor at Western Reserve College. Notice again, there's a bunch of question marks, and I found this, and I actually did write off to West Point to the alumni people, and I never got a reply back from them where he was during this time. I'm going to guess that he's on leave. That's the only thing I can figure out. Then he's an instructor at the Citadel, missing time, an instructor at West Point. He could have been out in private industry, and he could have been teaching at another college. 89 to 85, he's quartermaster of the 2nd Artillery. Once again, we don't know where he is. Now he's back to being an instructor at Massachusetts militia. This is, and then the Spanish-American War, he's chief mustering officer in Massachusetts. He's also becomes lieutenant colonel of the 5th Mass Infantry. Wait a minute, this is an artillery guy, and he's infantry. Well, yeah, it is true that quite often during the war with the Indians, whatever you want to call it, they would take Red Legs and convert them into infantry. And that is also true during the Mexican border incident of 1916, where a number of the Coast Artillery guys went over to the Mexican border and were used as infantry. In 1904, instructor at Fort Monroe. 04 to 8, he's on the general staff, a member of the Board of Ordnance and Fortification. 1908, 1911, he's over in what today we call the National Guard. The militia affairs, this is when they're reorganizing the militia units because they've had all this problem with them during the Spanish-American War. They showed up with all different types of arms, different types of uniform, different levels of training, fit and unfit in that. And the decision is, if these guys are really going to be our reserve, we're going to federalize them and we're going to set up minimum requirements and we're going to arm them and so forth and so on. Anyway, during 1911, 1918, during the World War I, he's chief of the Coast Artillery Corps. And he's faced with the great expansion of the Coast Artillery Corps. During his period, we disarmed some of the forts, batteries, I should say. We put their guns on rail cars, try to put some of them on tractor trailers, tractors, I should say. The Coast Artillery Corps just grows and grows as the anti-aircraft people take over. We're sending them over using them as heavy artillery, railroad guns down in Europe. We're taking over the 155s. Got 8-inchers coming in from the Brits. And they're mandating the large trench mortar guns, the mortars. We're not talking about the small ones. We're talking about the 4-inch ones and bigger. So there's this huge expansion that he's dealing with. 1918, as the war ends, he's retired. He wrote the Military Explosives, Chemical Symposium and Testing, and he was editor of the editor of the Artillery Journal for one issue, March, April 1902. Fort Weaver, Hawaii, been there, a very neat place, was named for the gentleman. He's got a mine planner named for him. From 43 to 44, one of the ones built up at West Virginia. Goes over the U.S. Navy, becomes a minesweeper of 55. Then gets switched over to the another minesweeper definition. All I know is she winds up the Sandy Hook pilot boat, New Jersey. And I did a thing through DANF, and the dates just aren't there. She just goes, and you go to the New Jersey pilot's website, and yeah, the New Jersey's there, but they never quite say when they get rid of her. And I never actually wrote to them to find out when they got rid of her. Our next one is Major General Frank W. Coe, born in Manhattan, Kansas, University of Kansas, and buried in Arlington National Cemetery. 1888 at West Point. 92 to 98, he's at Fort Hamilton, Fort Monroe, and Key West Barracks. Doesn't say what unit he's with, they just mention where he is. Then he comes back to West Point as an instructor. 9309 is the Submarine Defense School, and at West Point, once again, as instructors. You notice that during the Spanish-American War, he is not in the war zone. He is back. And during the Philippine insurrection, once again, he's not out in the field. He's being staffed. 1909, he's commanding officer of the Coast Artillery School at Fort Monroe. 1911, 1913 at Fort Leavenworth, once again going to school. 1913, 1916, he's commanding officer of Fort, I can never pronounce it, Camarada, I'm sorry, in Hawaii. 1916 to 17, he's down on the Mexican border. I believe that's misspelt wrong. I apologize. Where he's got a number of the Coast Artillery units as infantry. And if I remember correctly, during the 1917-16 period, all the Coast Artillery test firing they just didn't take place because they didn't have the men to man the Coast Artillery forts. They were stripped down, and every one of them were down to basically the garrison people manning it just to keep the weapons clean, because they're all down the Mexican border serving as infantry. During World War I, he's commanding officer of the 1st Separate Brigade, Coast Artillery, over in France. He comes back and he becomes chief of Coast Artillery Corps and retires in 26 and dies in 47. Unfortunately, they didn't think of him because they didn't name any gun battery for him or any mine planner. They just let him go. Our next one is Major General Andrew Hero, born New Orleans. You notice up they're all being buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Sorry, the phone's ringing in the background. I forgot to take it off the hook. Dumb of me. He was not a West Point graduate, but he will go all the way up. Notice the nice Coast Artillery insignia there on his collar. He joins the 4th Artillery as a lieutenant. Comes out of the militia, if I remember correctly. I'm sorry, it's either the Citadel or VMI. 98, he's in the 5th Artillery during the Spanish-American War. Then he goes into the staff in the Philippines during the insurrection. 1900, back to West Point. 02 to 07, he's editor of the Journal of Artillery. 07, commanding officer of the 85th Company, Coast Artillery. 08, commanding officer, Fort Flagler. 1909, assistant to the chief of the Coast Artillery Corps. You can see he's moving up. 1911, brigadier general, 1st Separate Brigade. 13, adjutant, South Atlantic Coast Artillery District. 1917, whoa, look at this. Commanding Officer 154th Field Artillery Brigade. He's in France. 1919, Commanding Officer 39th Coast Artillery Brigade. 21, Staff Officer of the 2nd Coast Artillery District, which is the New York area. 23, he's Commanding Officer of Coast Artillery Manila Bay. So he's got some really nice assignments. 24, back to the 4th Coast Artillery District, which is the it's down along the southern coast. That's the Charleston area in that. 26, retires. He's Chief Artillery Corps. At the end, he retires. So he retires getting his pension as a Major General. He was editor, as I said, from 06 to 07 of the Coast Artillery. Our next one is Golick, Major General John W. Golick. Born Goldsboro, North Carolina. 87, buried at Arlington. He starts off in the Spanish-American War as a lieutenant in the North Carolina infantry. They don't get overseas. He then volunteers to be an officer in the U.S. Volunteers going to the Philippines for the Philippine insurrection. And he gets as a captain. He's in the infantry, as you can see. And in 1901, he gets a regular commission in the Army Artillery as lieutenant. So in 03, he's a student at the artillery school. I think they decide since he's going to be an artilleryman, he ought to have some training as an artillery officer. 05, he's an instructor at the artillery school, which seems to say that he did good. He does this for quite a period, 05 to 11. 1911, he's a military attaché in Chile. It's a little plum assignment. 1950s with the Coast Artillery Corps in Texas. 16 at the Army War College. 1917, he's back over the infantry, Chief of Staff of the 40th Division, which does get to France. 1919, he's on the General Staff of the War Department. 24, Executive Officer, Fort Hancock, New Jersey. 25, Commanding Officer, Harbor Defense of Sandy Hook. 26, Executive Officer of the Military Bureau. He's back dealing with the National Guard. 36, Commanding Officer of the 2nd Coast Artillery District. 37, he's Commanding Officer Fort Monroe. Now, let's go back in this. Once again, he was Chief of the Coast Artillery back in 30. I skipped over that. In the port of embarkation. He reverted back from Major General to Colonel. I have no idea why he would do that, except that he decided that he would be moving on up. And he does retire as a Brigadier General. Interesting. Fort Golick, Panama Canal's named for him, which used to house the U.S. Army School of the Americas. That bad place that were trained all these people from South America, Army officers to be dictators and go out and kill all their people. I had a lot of friends when I was teaching part-time who would just constantly tell me all about the bad things the School of the Americas did in training Army officers for the South American countries. And when I would try to explain to them that 0.1% of the ones that were trained there went that way, and that you were anyway, beside the point. Got off on that. Our next one is Major General William Frederick Haas, 74 in Milwaukee, and once again winds up buried in Arlington Cemetery. 1898. Actually, I got that wrong. He's in the field artillery at that point. He becomes Chief of Staff to General Somerville. All it says he becomes chief, and we don't get a date. And we're missing a whole bunch of dates within here. What happens to him? It's weird how some of these guys there's a long, good explanation of what they did, and other ones, there's nothing there. He goes to commanding officer at Winfield Scott, and then he's commanding officer of the 45th Regiment with the American Expeditionary Force in France. That is an artillery regiment he's there with. They bring him back in 1918, and they do this with a whole bunch of officers who've gotten some combat experience, and then bring them back to the United States to provide some experience to the guys back to what we really need in France. And he's senior assistant to the chief of the Coast Artillery Corps, and he gets a Distinguished Service Cross for plan development on what the Coast Artillery Corps is to be like when the war is over with. And he goes in the service supply in 1919, which is really not really an artillery assignment, but there he is over there. 1930, he comes back, and he's been over there a long time in the service supply, where he's made executive assistant to the chief of Coast Artillery. And 34, 35, he's being chief. So it's a strange assignment pattern that he goes through. You can see he's been a staff officer along the way, and maybe that's what they decided they needed, was a staff officer. Fourth Haas is named for him. Back when he was a colonel. They name a transport for him. Our next one is Harry Steele, born in Arkansas, buried in Arlington. Once again, we got a guy who's coming in through the lower levels. He comes in as a private in Battery A, 5th Artillery. When the Spanish-American War comes along, he gets promoted to a second lieutenant. 1901, he gets promoted to captain. I assume he's still within the 7th Artillery because it doesn't say, and that would make sense for him to remain in the 7th Artillery. In 06, he's commanding officer of the 93rd Company Coast Artillery at Fort Stevens. 1908, he's in Oregon and Florida with the Coast Artillery Corps, floating around. Various assignments. 1911, he's with the Coast Defense in New York. Once again, he's in various assignments. He's at no one place. It's like we don't have enough officers, and they're constantly moving him around from battery to battery, fort to fort. Since he gets where he is, he can't be an incompetent. So I'm taking it he's moving them around to take care of problems. 1915, he's quartermaster over the Philippines. 1960, he's quartermaster in Harbor Defense of Los Angeles, where he remains throughout World War I. 1919, he's down in Panama. 22, he becomes commanding officer, Coast Defense of Balboa. 22, he's only there a short time. They bring him back to the Army War College. Then they send him to staff. He becomes staff of the Coast Artillery Corps. 31, he goes to Hawaii as commanding officer. And 35, he's chief of the Coast Artillery Corps and retires. Battery Steele, Portland, Maine, 2 16-inch guns. You why he gets things named and the previous 3 don't get anything named for him? I guess it's office politics. Archibald Sutherland, born in Illinois, 76, buried in Arlington. He's a West Point guy. He goes to Columbus Barracks. Then he goes to the Philippines, artillery. Fort Riley, he's artillery, not Coast Artillery Corps. And then he goes to West Point as an instructor. 1910, he's now in the Coast Artillery Corps, and he's at Fort Ward. 1911 at Fort Moreau. 1914, with the war going on in Europe, he's sent to Belgium as a military attaché. This is really weird if you read about this whole thing. President Wilson gets very upset that we're sending attachés to the war zone. Why are we sending attachés to the war zone? Well, gee, we're supposed to be neutral in thought and deed. If we're sending guys to the war zone, we're not being neutral in thought and deed. So what these guys are able to do is really restrict it on, and they get beat up later by people looking back by the reports they're sending in. But President Wilson just says, hey guys, you can't go out there and do this stuff. In 1916, I believe it is, the Fort Leavenworth does a study. Their assignment for that year is to do a plan of attack by Germany on the United States. And when President Wilson finds out about that, he almost closes down the school and abolishes the general staff, the little general staff that the Army has, because you're supposed to be neutral in thought and deed. This plays out on afterwards, and I thought this was interesting. If you remember in the 1950s, when the Army is training, they are not training to fight the Russians. They're training to fight some weird outfit who wears an American helmet with some thing to the top of it, and nothing that they do is really related to fighting the Russians. That goes back to President Wilson saying, you guys aren't supposed to be trained to fight somebody who we might actually fight, because that's not being neutral in thought and deed. It's only when Reagan becomes in office that we actually start training to fight the Russians, at least the Army does. The Navy apparently isn't covered by this rule, because you do during the 1920s, by 30s, the only one the Navy's trained to fight is the Japanese. Okay, all done we got on this. 1907, he's director of the Heavy Artillery School at Mailly in France. 1918, he comes back to CEO this Camp Eustis, which is also a training place for the artillery going over. 1920, General Staff College. 22, staff in the Philippines. 25, at Fort Monroe. 29, commanding officer, Harbor Defense Puget Sound. 30, chief of staff, Hawaiian Division. 32, he's on the Coast Artillery Board. And 35, he's made chief of the Coast Artillery Corps and retires in 1940 due to age. He had an article reported in the Journal of Artillery. Not really a great article, but it's an interesting article. I just put it up there. And now we move to Greene. He isn't buried at Arlington. He's buried at Fort Sam Houston. And Greene is a buddy of General Marshall, George Marshall. Let's put that out front, because what we're going to talk about is some problems along the way. Greene is a cadet at West Point, goes to Fort Totten upon graduating. Aha, he's on a mine planner, 07 to 10, the Knox. Back to West Point as an instructor. 1912 to 1913, Fort Baker, out San Francisco. 13 to 16, it's at Corregidor. 16 to 17 at New Orleans, Jackson Barracks. World War I with the 52nd Coast Artillery in France, 155s and 8 inches. Then he comes back and goes to the Coast Artillery School. Then he goes to Command and Staff College. And then he's editor of the Coast Artillery Journal, 27 to Fort Totten. 27 to 30, he's with the War Department at the old War Department building in D.C., during which period and into the 20s, you were not allowed to wear a uniform if you were in Washington, D.C. Strange order. 30 to 31, he's at Command General Staff College. Then he goes to commanding officer of the 61st CA Anti-Aircraft at Fort Sheridan. He was with them when they do the movement to Fort Sheridan from the East Coast. 37th Headquarters, 8th Corps, San Antonio. He's the Coast Artillery guy within the 8th Corps. Then 40, he's XO, the chief of the CA. And 42 is made chief of the Coast Artillery Corps. 42 to 44, he's commanding officer of the Anti-Aircraft Command. 46, he retires, but they immediately bring him back as Secretary of the War Personnel Board through World War II. He is I don't say buddy of General George Marshall. He's in General George Marshall's little black book as a good guy. And this is why he becomes chief of the Coast Artillery Corps. And we're going to be talking now about some of the things I did put in about editor of the Coast Artillery Corps. Okay, we're going to do a slight shift here. And we're going to talk about what happens to these. George Marshall was in World War I. He was a planner, a staff officer, did some fabulous stuff in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Without Marshall's planning, it would have been a real disaster. He's got the wherewithal to move people around. He comes back and they send him down to Fort Gordon. Sorry, mine went blank. Where he reorganizes the U.S. infantry, gets to know everybody, and starts thinking the long-term problem, what we're going to do when the new war comes along. He is stationed at Fort Stevens with his thing. And I believe this is the part where he develops his hatred of the Coast Artillery Corps. Make no mistake, he hates the Coast Artillery Corps because he's in this very nice housing down there. And then he gets moved out to the Army bases, infantry ones, which have terrible housing. They're condemnable housing. Why do the Coast Artillery have this very nice housing in a very nice town with all these very nice things? And then us infantry guys have got all this terrible stuff out there. Okay. When he's reported chief of staff, he has organizational problems with all the chiefs. All the branches have a chief in charge of them. But he's got real problems with the chief of the artillery, Coast Artillery, cavalry, infantry. And by the way, I forgot to put the Air Corps in there. They need to be put in there too. I don't know why I left them out. But he's got problems with them. General Marshall wants a mechanized combined arms army. This isn't what he says, but this is what he wants. Let's go back to World War I. Marshall has a real learning experience in World War I. He quickly realizes that horses are a bad deal. Pershing is pushing to get a cavalry division to Europe. And the War Department says to General Pershing, hey, we can send you a 24,000 man infantry division using X amount of tonnage. And for the same X amount of tonnage, we can send you a 12,000 man cavalry division. Well, wait a minute, what's going on? You can cram men together, you can't cram horses together. And for Y tonnage, we can support a 24,000 man infantry division. And for Y tonnage, the same amount, we can support a cavalry division. Why? Because we need to import all this food, some 30 pounds of food per day, per horse, to keep them healthy and wealthy and moving along. Marshall looks at the Ford trucks and the four-wheel drive company trucks he's got over there and goes, wait a minute, they don't need all this need to keep them going. And by the way, these Caterpillar tractors really operate well pulling guns around. What I want is a army built on trucks and tracks, wheels and tracks. And he runs into problems as he's talking about this in 1940. I said he doesn't call it combined arms because I don't think he quite understands what combined arms mean, but this is what he wants. The Army at this time is divided into combat forces and technical support forces. And he really wants these teams to work in harmony together because he saw the problems during World War II where the Signal Corps and the Ordnance Department and the Transportation Department are not talking to everybody. And the head of the Army really doesn't have any power. This is one thing Marshall demands and gets from Roosevelt is power to exercise what he wants. In 1940, he takes Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair and he activates the General Headquarters, U.S. Army, and he activates Army Ground Forces. And what he's going to do is try and pull the other groups underneath Army Ground Forces. McNair is going to be the guy who's going to be doing this. Okay, here's our head of the artillery. 1938-942. Marshall and McNair want to get away with horse-drawn artillery. Forget this stuff. We want truck-drawn, and this is where you start seeing the big tires going on the 105s. They want to get rid of the 75s. They want to go to the 105s, and the Danforth say, well, wait a minute. I still need my pack artillery. I still need my 75s. I need this. And Marshall and McNair say, forget it. We're standardizing on 105s and 155s, and that's all you're going to have in the artillery. Actually, they wind up with the 8-inch guns, some of the bigger guns. But this is what they want to standardize. And Danforth is still a World War I guy, and this is no Hart's artillery, 75 open sights, so forth and so on. So they're not getting anywhere with him. Our next problem he runs in is General George A. Lynch of the infantry. Back up. And he also wants mechanized track-drawn artillery. He's seen what the Germans done, and he wants, and Danforth isn't interested in this. Yeah, tractors pulling it, but put them up on, no. I don't want to mount it on tractors. That ain't going to work. He's over here. Yep, back up. I need one more thing. I'm sorry. And the idea of the artillery working with tanks is nowhere within his vocabulary. We get over to Lynch. The tanks have been over to Lynch. And Lynch is World War I minded. He can't get out of trench warfare. He wants the tanks supported the infantry. He's got with the French, you don't need a tank move faster than 10 miles per hour. If it can, it will run away from the infantry when they're doing the attack across the field. So tanks are supposed to have a speed less than 10 miles per hour, mounted with machine guns or maybe a 37 millimeter cannon. But that's all we need. And this isn't what Marshall wants. He's still thinking of infantry tanks. He wants something with a 75 millimeter gun at least. And we get over to Herr, John Noll's Herr. He will not convert any cavalry regiment to armor. He tells them out front, you ain't going to do this until I get the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd cavalry divisions activated, fully manned with horse-mounted men. Forget it. You're not going to convert any of my cavalry guys over to armor. And Patton and a couple of the other cavalry guys go to her and say, wait a minute, we need to start converting. And Herr says, you're with me, right? We're just going to be cavalrymen because that's what we need in the war. And you start seeing in 40, 41, the guys who are going to become the major army armored division commanders and during World War II, leaving the cav and moving off over the armor, which is not a service branch. A very interesting book. Lynch writes this. The Story of the U.S. Cavalry, 1775-1942, published in 53 by Little Brown. But what is really interesting is he talks about the first cav in Korea during the Korean War. And it's like he thinks there's a horse-mounted outfit over there. They're not. It is, you got to read this book. It's sort of weird in a way, but interesting. And then, I misspelled Arnold. Oh, my Lord. See, I told you Mary Ann did not do this. I'm sorry. Okay, his other problem was General Arnold. The bomber will always get through. All we need is bombers, and within 5 days, I'll have won the war. He doesn't say how the bombers are going to get to Europe And by the way, it turns out while they're going to bomb German industry, they have no idea where the German industries are located at, and so forth and so on. And the infantry, cavalry, and artillery is simply there to support the bombers. And once the bombers have blown everything away and the enemy surrendered, the infantry, cavalry, and artillery will show up. And we really don't need any tanks. We need to take all that money and buy me bombers. Okay. So what we get is in 42, the organization of the armored forces under Chaffee. And they go and abolish actually, he doesn't abolish it. What I think is very interesting is what Marshall does is when the chiefs of the various services, the coast artillery, the infantry, terms are up, he accepts their, okay, guy, here you are, pat on the back, but he doesn't appoint anybody to take their place. And there is some, hers goes to Congress and over this, demanding that they appoint somebody to take my place. Congress has got too much other things going on with World War II going. I think it's in 1943 that Marshall puts in something abolishing the chiefs. But that ends the chiefs of the coast artillery. They were very important in the structure of the artillery. They're staff officers, but they keep the force together. They work on it. But they are in each little billywhack, and there is no interaction between them, which is what the Marshals' problem is and why McNair gets appointed Army Ground Forces, which is put in place. After World War II, Army Ground Forces disappears, but that's another story. So I sort of took this a little bit farther than we want, but let's go back to what happens in Coast Artillery. In 42, Greene, as I said, is an anti-aircraft guy. And they really, in 42, the Coast Artillery Corps, the fixed fortifications are sort of forgotten about. And everything, okay, they're spending money. Don't get me wrong. They're doing things because the politicians want to spend money to build along the coast and things like that. But this is what he's really interested in, is anti-aircraft command. They are all still tied up in the German blitzkrieg of 1940, 39 in Poland, 40 in France, 41 into Russia. And the German anti-aircraft hitting the front lines and that. And they're big into anti-aircraft. That. One of the other interesting things, a side point on this, is the anti-tank command that's put together like this. All the thinking is, I don't know, is strange. It's sort of defensive, although they're going to go on the offensive. And for a lot of the things they're putting together, like the anti-tank command with their towed artillery, towed anti-tank guns, aren't very good for an offensive operation. And a lot of this stuff they're putting together is good for defensive, but not offensive operations. Although not to say that they didn't do great stuff setting up the guns along the northeastern coast of England in 44 for the V1 attacks, or the large defense they built up around Antwerp in 44, 45 to defend against the attacks upon that port there. But anyway, Greene takes converts Coast Artillery Corps into anti-aircraft command, moves a lot of the, I hate to say better officers, that's a wrong word, but moves a lot of officers over into the anti-aircraft, and basically allows the Harbor Defense Command to sort of wither on the vine. As you all know, that the senior NCOs were stuck in that there was no way they could transfer over to any other command. The senior officers are stuck in the, if you're a captain or lower, yeah, you can probably move over to something else. If you're a E4 or lower in the Coast Artillery, you can most probably move somewhere else. But otherwise, you're stuck there and you aren't going to get any combat. And that's all, folks. And I